Welcome to Israel Explained, where we explain Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name's Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passage's resident scholar, Josiah McGee. Today, we're discussing what is terrorism and how do we define it. As terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah have made news headlines around the world, many people have begun to question, how exactly do we define terrorism? At many anti-Israel protests or college encampments at universities around the United States, people have defined Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel as an act of resistance rather than an act of terror. So how exactly do we define terrorism? Well, today we're unpacking it all for you. So, Josiah, this question of how do we define terrorism, what is terrorism versus what is resistance, this is a question that we have seen a lot. So where do you think exactly this kind of question is coming from?
This is a great question, and I think this whole conversation is going to be really interesting and really important. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. But it comes up, I think, a lot because there's a fight over the definition of these terms in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has a lot to do with which side you take on the conflict. And really what it comes down to is depending on which side of the conflict you're on, there's a temptation to overgeneralize the way that we characterize certain behaviors. And we're doing that in an attempt to essentially claim the moral high ground and cast your opponent as purely evil or purely on the side of good.
Yeah.
And what that leads to then is basically saying that anything this person does that I don't agree with is terrorism, or anything that this person does that I support is resistance, not terrorism. And the reality is often a little bit more nuanced than that. And it's just challenging to see that nuance when you're sort of blinded, I think, a little bit by your loyalty to one side or the other of the conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So how exactly do we define terrorism?
Yeah, good question. So we need to define both of our terms. So we'll start with terrorism for sure. So terrorism, basically, a fairly simple but technical definition is unlawful political violence, especially that which is directed towards civilians. So let's break that down a little bit. Some of the terms within the definition, the terms within the term. Unlawful, basically meaning it's a form of violence which is typically against the rules of war. Or of combat. It's going to be pretty terrible and in violation of some norms and expectations about ethical conduct when it comes to the use of violence.
Yeah.
It is political violence as well. This is important to understand. There's a specific political objective in mind. And I think this is something that goes overlooked quite a bit when we study different terror organizations or we read about them in the news. You hear different headlines and you assume, wow, what a bunch of psychos. What were they thinking? What are they trying to accomplish? Like, what do they think they're going to accomplish by engaging in terrorism?
Yeah.
The reality is, generally speaking, they're actually very logical. You don't have to agree with the logic in order to understand that there is a logic and they're thinking rationally and there is a specific political objective in mind, something that they're trying to accomplish. And then the last component is that it generally, maybe not always, but generally speaking, it's easiest to recognize terrorism when civilians are involved. If it targets civilians, it's terrorism.
Yeah. So can terrorism be conducted by a government, or is it only ever something that happens with a terrorist organization?
It's a good question. So yes, and it's a little bit of both. But most often, what you recognize most easily as terrorism is something that's been conducted by an organization or would also be referred to as a non-state actor, meaning that they don't represent a government or a country, but they're an organization that exists for a political purpose that they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
So names that we're probably somewhat familiar with, at least, in the United States especially, Al-Qaeda, for example, or ISIS. These are terror organizations. We recognize them as such very easily. They're easily recognized because they fight in asymmetric ways, typically because they don't have the amount of power that a government does. You have to fight in asymmetric ways. You engage in different guerrilla tactics, or you find ways to hit soft targets that are easier to hit, like civilians, because it's hard if you're fighting against a government to hit a military target, for example. And it's relatively easy to recognize these forms of terrorism or to recognize a terror organization because the imbalance of power tends to lead to the kind of behaviors that we can easily recognize or identify as terrorist in nature. It's a little bit more challenging with the government to recognize when they're involved in terrorism somehow because they enjoy the imbalance of power. It actually works in their favor. So it's not always quite as obvious when a government is involved in terrorism. That being said, there are still cases in which you can kind of look at the behavior of a government and say, okay, this might be, depending on how we're defining terrorism, you could make a case that a government is also involved in terrorism, whether that is using chemical weapons against civilians, like Syria has been accused of in the past, or if it is sponsoring terror organizations, like Iran is accused of paying for, subsidizing, or sponsoring terror activities by other organizations around the Middle East. In that situation, you can start to build a case that a government is also at least somewhat responsible for acts of terror.
So something that we've mentioned a little bit earlier is resistance. So some people have defined certain acts of terror, particularly related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as an act of resistance when it really is an act of terror. So how exactly do we define act of resistance?
So an act of resistance is pretty simply an effort to refuse to comply with or to offer some opposition to authority. That's basically what it means to resist or to be engaged in resistance. And I think it is important as well, as we're kind of defining our terms, to draw some distinction. It's not always a perfectly clear line, but some distinction between violent and nonviolent resistance. So there's nonviolent resistance, which basically is engaging in some form of like a strike or a boycott or a protest or something like that. Civil disobedience, in the civil rights era of the United States, this was a form of resistance, but it was nonviolent in nature. Then there's also violent resistance, which typically means combat of some kind or engaging in some form of violent behavior towards an authority, a government, or something like that.
So what are the key differences between the two?
So really the primary key is the use of force, but also I think the second thing that is important to sort of understand, well, again, let's look at some examples. If we're looking at some examples from American history and from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in its history as well. So again, in American history, you have this is history in the civil rights era of civil disobedience. That's an example of a form of protest or a form of resistance that's nonviolent in nature because you're not attempting to use force so much as you are simply refusing to obey or to comply with a command that is being given. In that case, because the civil rights movement identified that there were unjust demands that were being made, and so they refused to obey. Now, in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you do have some examples of this as well. Typically, it looks like a strike. And I don't mean like an airstrike, I mean a labor strike. So basically, there's a general strike called by the leadership, and they issue instructions basically saying, don't go to work today, everyone, because we're going to engage in a labor strike, and we're going to try to put pressure on the authorities or on Israel by causing them some economic pain.
So you gave us some examples of resistance with being strikes intended to cause economic pain, things like that. So can you give us some examples of terrorism?
Yeah. So terrorism, here's the trick, is that violent resistance quickly becomes terrorism if you're not careful. And the issue is that there is a matter of targets, which is typically very difficult to identify the line between them, or it can be very difficult to identify a line. And violent resistance becomes terrorism when the force is used not against the government or an authority figure, but against someone who doesn't have practical authority.
Mm-hmm.
So we can take a look at a couple of examples of how this works. And Hamas is really a great example to use because it's recognized as a terror organization by the international community.
Mm-hmm.
And there's two ways in which they engage in terrorism by using not just force, but by using force against the wrong people. And that's really the crux of the matter when it comes to defining or recognizing terrorism.
Yeah.
So Hamas, if you look at, for example, October 7, they engaged in some pretty horrific behaviors and activities on October 7. And they tried to spin the issue as, well, this is really a form of resistance because what we're doing is attacking the Israeli government. We are resisting them, resisting, quote unquote, the occupation.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain degree, they did attack some military installations.
Mm-hmm.
Hamas did attack an IDF base, multiple IDF bases actually, on October 7.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't stop there.
Yeah.
They didn't just attack an IDF base or take prisoner different IDF soldiers. They also attacked a number of people who had no business being involved in combat because they weren't wearing uniforms, they weren't carrying weapons, they were unarmed. In some cases, they were asleep at home in their beds or they were at a party, a music festival. And so these people are clearly unlawful targets because they don't have uniforms on, or they're not carrying weapons or anything like that. And they have no practical authority.
Mm-hmm.
So when Hamas argued that it was resisting Israel by committing these acts of violence on October 7, they were lying because only a fraction of what happened on October 7 had anything to do with the IDF or the Israeli government. The vast majority of the people that were affected, killed, tortured, or kidnapped were unlawful targets, and they had no authority, no reason for Hamas to be angry with them. The second example, I think, in which Hamas, in many cases, has engaged in some form of terrorism is by not only putting Israelis at risk and targeting Israeli civilians when they shouldn't, which, by the way, includes not just October 7, but also the rocket campaign that came before it. They've also put many Palestinian civilians at risk. And this is something I think is difficult to wrap your mind around if you're not familiar with the terrain and the politics of the Gaza Strip. Hamas doesn't just fire rockets randomly at Israeli civilians. They have to choose because the Gaza Strip is a very small area. You're talking about maybe 140 square miles. You're talking about multi-millions of Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, probably around 2 million, something like that.
Yeah.
And it's a very dense area, small area, densely populated. Most of the population is concentrated even tighter into these major urban areas. And Hamas is deliberately choosing those locations. It's not choosing a random field to set up a rocket launcher. It's choosing a hospital or a school or a mosque or something like that as the location from where it's going to conduct its terrorist operations against Israel. What winds up happening is people don't recognize this, I don't think. Hamas isn't just engaging in terrorism because it's hurting Israeli civilians. It's engaging in terrorism because it's conducting unlawful operations. Under international law, Hamas has no business setting up a command center or a rocket launcher or a hostage containment cell inside a hospital. But it did all of those things, all of which are unlawful and all of which put not only Israeli but also Palestinian civilians at risk. So what it's doing is effectively terrorizing not just Israelis but also Palestinians and taking advantage of them in the process. Which is why it's if it's studied closely enough, the issue of how Hamas does what it does, it's I think fairly easy to identify as terrorism.
Yeah. You provided a lot of really helpful context when thinking about terrorism, particularly what's happening in Israel and Gaza right now. Can you tell us a little bit about how this distinction between terrorism and resistance should influence the way we think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah, well, I can try. So I think first things first, it's a really terrible crime. And it's a terrible accusation to make.
Mm-hmm.
I think something we have to be, as Christians who think seriously about this issue, we have to treat this very seriously. We shouldn't make this accusation lightly.
Absolutely.
Because the last thing you want is to mislabel something and then be accused of crying wolf or something like that.
Yeah.
And then when you need somebody to believe you or believe the truth, when something happens, when something horrible happens, people won't believe you.
Yeah.
So we have to really think about that and to take that seriously. Like, it's a horrible accusation, and we need to be sure that it's accurate before we start throwing terms like terrorism around. On the flip side of that, though, I think we need to be more careful and think more critically when we hear terms like resistance thrown around. You know, you've referenced many cases of protests in the U.S. There are protests in Europe. There's protests on college campuses. Actions of organizations like Hamas frequently being falsely characterized as resistance and not as terrorism.
Yeah.
And we have to understand what's true and what's not. Are those claims true or are they not? And unfortunately, in most cases, I don't think they are true, that people are accurately classifying the actions of a terror organization as terrorism, or they're calling it resistance instead, and that's just not true.
Yeah.
But we have to also dig a little bit deeper, okay? You have to be able to tell the difference between terrorism and resistance, whether someone's telling you the truth or not, but you also have to be able to discern, why are they saying what they're saying? And this is important for a couple of reasons, because there's a few different options. Either they're misinformed, they just don't know any better because someone hasn't bothered to explain it to them and give them the context. Either that or they are very well informed and they're deliberately deceiving people around them with the use of the terms incorrectly. Or they really do think that civilians are a legitimate target for violence, that there's nothing wrong with what Hamas did on October 7.
Yeah.
All of those options are a little bit scary, but they're not all the same.
Yeah.
And you really have to be able to tell which one it is, like where someone's coming from, why they're using a label like resistance in place of terrorism.
Yeah.
Both for the sake of the conversation, but also, frankly, for the sake of your own safety if you're going to
Absolutely.
engage in some dialogue about these issues. The last thing I would say is that people, by mislabeling their actions and convincing other people to do the same, can quite literally get away with murder. Okay, Hamas has one of the most sophisticated propaganda operations in the world. They are remarkably good at committing horrifying acts of atrocities and then convincing people to either forget about them, to deny them, or to justify them in a very short amount of time. Okay, that's a problem. They're very good at it. They're very, very good at it, and that's not going to change unless someone speaks up.
Yeah.
So I think it's important as Christians, if we're thinking about these issues and if we care about basic values like human life, the human life made in the image of God, when we see something being mislabeled, it might seem like it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal.
Absolutely.
And we need to speak up and we need to share what we know and understand to actually be true. And that can take different forms. It depends on your own circles of influence, certainly. Maybe that's social media for some people. Maybe that's your friends. Maybe that's your church. Maybe it's your family. Who knows?
Yeah.
But if and when you hear something like this, I think we need to be willing to stand up and say, that's not okay. That's not actually true. That's not what really happened. And if no one's going to say anything, someone's going to get away with murder.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Josiah, thank you so much for sharing with us today and helping us unpack some heavy topics, some complex topics, but some topics that are very crucial and very important. And to our audience, thank you so much for listening to another episode of Israel Explained. If you'd like more resources on this topic, check out the notes in the description below. If you have any questions about anything that we talked about today, leave a comment below and we would love to answer your question. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.